Welcome again to the Rightly Dividing podcast. This is a podcast for those who love God, who want to know more about God, and want to empower others to know about God. Today I'm joined with my co-host, Uncle Ayo is here. Uncle Femi might be joining us in and out a little bit, so you might see him show up here. But if not, it would just be the two of us today then. So far we've been walking through the book of Revelation in this season, right? And the last time we were on here, we walked through Revelations 12 to 16 in that sense. And so today we're going to focus on Revelation 17 to 19, probably up to verse 5, I think. We might go a little bit longer than that. We'll see how much time we have. But as we segue into this particular part of Revelation, I might actually start out by reading a little bit of the verses here because I think it's quite interesting just to get us started in that sense. Unquire, if you don't mind, let me just read Revelation 17, 1 to 6. I think it
Yeah, go ahead.
introduces, key interesting figures. So Revelation chapter 17, it says, Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I greatly marveled. With that said, Uncle, I wanted us to start off with this question. Like, as we get into this section of Revelation, we are introduced to these two characters, like Babylon the Great, this prostitute or this woman, right, and a scarlet beast. And I just wanted you to help lay the groundwork in terms of who is this woman? What are some descriptive features of this woman? And what should we expect as we get into this new section of Revelation?
Yeah, good question, Tolu. Yeah, we've already seen references in our previous episodes to John's vision referring to Babylon. In Revelations 14 and Revelation 16. So in a previous episode that Tolu referenced, Babylon was referred to there. So interesting enough, obviously for those of you that are Bible scholars, you recognize that word Babylon has some Old Testament connotations that, from the Old Testament's perspective, was a physical location. It was a capital city of the Babylonians that destroyed Jerusalem. A lot of the major prophets, actually all the major prophets, both Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, references Babylon, at least from a physical perspective. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want to set the stage in that, in the physical sense of Babylon, it was a city. The Babylonians were ones that opposed God's people, right? So it also sat along the banks of the Euphrates River. And in the previous episode, we read that in Revelation 16 about Babylon falling with regards to that. So I believe John was in his vision, there was not necessarily speaking on the physical location, but he definitely recognized the importance of what Babylon not only represents from a spiritual perspective, but also the physical end in being opposed to God's people. So that's why I wanted to bring that up, that from the physical sense, there was an opposition to God's people. And in Revelation, it depicts Babylon as the city who opposed God spiritually and persecuted his people, just as Tolu has read earlier on. So, the obviously, in the physical sense, Babylon today, a lot of ancient archaeologists believe it's in somewhere in Iraq, near Baghdad actually, and there's a lot of reference to cities in ruins today. So it didn't aspire to the greatness it used to be under Nebuchadnezzar, and I think another king, Hammurabi, was also known as the kings of Babylon during the times that they were in existence. And even Saddam Hussein was recognized as wanting to build Babylon. But the physical echoes of what that Babylon represents is in ruins today. And what we're going to be studying today is also representative. We see the same thing captured in today's episode as we're going to study Revelations 17 and 18, whereby the fall of Babylon in what it represents is also in ruins, and in this case actually utterly destroyed because of the influence that it has. I don't know, Tolu, if you want me to pause or you have anything you want to share. So
Yeah, no, I think all that you said aligns with exactly my perspective on this as well. I thought it was interesting that so far we've gone through this seven seals, seven trumpets, which you see as cycles of judgment, the seven bowls, and we had that giant prelude between Revelation 12 and 14, which I think is talking about similar things, but seven symbolic histories. And what I see about this section is, while we've gone through like those cycles of judgment, right? And I think from different view, and it's important that I say that because there are possibly other interpretations or way of looking at that. I kind of see this section now as almost like having this laser focus on specific figures that God is bringing judgment on. And then we start off with this woman or this prostitute, right? Babylon the Great. Like you rightly said, we can see the Old Testament connotation of what Babylon represents. Obviously, we don't think this is a literal woman in that sense, and things like the sexual immorality that's spoken of, I think, is more about idolatry and unfaithfulness to God, not in the sense of any kind of physical act in that sense. I thought it was also interesting that it talks about how she's seated on many waters, just in this
yes,
first section, right? And because part of what I want us to think through is that who is Babylon? What is Babylon, right? And it's
correct.
interesting to start looking at some of these features in that sense. And I guess that would be my next question on Quire, is that how would you describe, or what would you say Babylon represents? Like
Yeah.
either to us or in John's revelation in this instance. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tolu. I, at least in reading Revelation 17 and 18, these two depictions, these two critical depictions of what Revelation 17 describes Babylon is, and then in Revelations 18, from I would say one interpretation there would be Revelation 17 kind of shows a little bit beyond Babylon on this false religion or world religion that it represents because of, like you have referenced on it being covered over many waters. It's obviously, we'll get to the beast, but this is currently about the woman right now. And so this one interpretation that I would say I could see would be Babylon being shown in this case as having religious power in opposition to the worship of God. So this is one that whereby it's promoting idolatry, as you mentioned, or abomination. Hence the name that you have read about in the first section there. It's a symbol of apostasy. Apostasy is just a falling away. That's what that word means, just falling away. And it's connected to various religious practices. Funny enough, the physical side that I just explained was known for that. They celebrated a variety of religions that is different from in opposition to the worship of Yahweh.
That's right.
And I believe John is not too far off in the vision that he sees here in depicting Babylon in that symbol of those idolatry and abominations in opposition to the worship of Jehovah. So that in some versions you read, I like the way Tolu read it. It said this mystery. It's not necessarily a mystery that is concealed. It's a mystery of just showing that it's not part of the title of Babylon. It's just a reflection of the mysteriousness about what is written in her forehead. So I believe that Babylon here just represents the symbolizes the world religious system. In chapter 18, and we'll get to that, the emphasis there, the way the imagery that John shows more this it's still a world system, but it's talking more, in my opinion, and just it's much talking about the political and more the economic side of it. So because of the reference to going deeper on what happens there in the lament and everything going on. But basically it's just a world system or that is in opposition to God in whatever way you want to see it. In this case, I think it's more closely tied to the religion that is in opposition to the full worship of Yahweh. So I think that's what Babylon represents here.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that, Okwaya. And I am in agreement with what you've said. I think the way I have seen it, again, thinking of the symbolic approach to looking at Revelation is, like you rightly said, right, we've encountered this particular phrasing of Babylon in a couple chapters already in Revelation, right? It's in Revelation 14:18, Revelation 16:19. We've encountered just statements, and it's usually statements about judgment. And when I read this passage and also 18, the conclusion I came to when I think of Babylon is I kind of see it as, how would I put it? I see it almost as fallen human culture or world system, like you rightly said, in all its apparent glory and arrogance. I think it's a system of the world, which is in
Yes.
opposition to God, right? It encompasses the economics, the commerce, the wealth, like not just all those things in particular, but also the mindset, the values of that world system.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how I see that. And I also thought it was interesting in terms of how I was reading it, is that when you look at some of the descriptions, even in just this first 6 verses, there's almost like this description on the outward of what it represents, right? The influence it has, right? It's arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, right? And what you see on the outside is almost like things are glorious, they are great in that sense, but then the real description of it is actually more hideous than that. So very much aligned with what you're saying, that it's a world system or a system of the world opposed to God,
Correct.
in opposition to
I,
God.
I and I like how you phrased it on your last statement there, that on the outside of it, there's this dazzling
Yes.
glory that it shows that even John himself was amazed.
Marvel.
and,
Yep.
and the angel had to, I don't know whether you want to call it rebuke or remind him that, hey, this is not
Yep.
something, this thing that you're amazed about is going to be destroyed. So
That's
let's keep that in
yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
So it's important that this war system or what Babylon depicts may in its it dazzling to the eyes. It's
That's right.
what remember it's the same John tells us. The things that are in opposition to God are three things, right?
Lost of the eyes.
Yes, the the deception of the eyes of the mind
Yep.
and what the pride of life. So it's
That's right.
incredible that you see those things that any of those things are not part of the Father, as John
That's right.
pointed out.
That's right.
So we want, from what Tolu and I are sharing, if you're listening to this, our goal is to just tell you that the goal here is this is in opposition to God,
That's right.
and obviously we know, as we have been identifying in previous sessions, and we'll do it here. Actually, the whole purpose of 17 and 18 is to finally declare the destruction
That's right.
of this world system. Whatever way you want to look at it,
Yep.
it is the whole purpose behind where we see is the finality of this world system being destroyed, so.
That's right. That's right. I wanted to quickly highlight a couple more things before we go to the next question, which is just to highlight the influence that Babylon, the
Yes.
great, this fallen world system has, right? It talks about her sitting on many waters, right? Which you will come to see that the many waters refers to nations in that
Yes.
sense, right? And it talks about how the kings of the earth has committed sexual immorality with her, which basically depicts like this. They've been in partnership with her in their idolatry and they're
Yeah.
turning their backs against God. And I think for us Christians, we have to realize that idolatry or turning our backs against God or turning our backs towards God, it doesn't necessarily mean you're bowing down to an idol, right? Sometimes it's way more subtle than that. It's what you hold dear in your heart. It's what you live for in that sense. It's the things you pursue, right? And it's also interesting to see how those who are truly faithful, right, are being martyred, right? It says that she's drunk with the blood of the saints, right? So
Yeah.
there's an opposition to God there that I think it's clear for us to see. I
Yeah.
wanted to shift though because it did
Yeah.
say
Let's do
that
that.
yeah, she's seated on a scarlet beast that is full of blasphemous names. And I just wanted you to help us set the stage that what does this scarlet beast represent? Like what imagery does it remind you of or evoke in you? And what do you think the scarlet beast represents?
Yeah. Yeah. So in a previous recording, previous episode, we had shared actually in the previous chapters of two beasts. One beast from the sea and one beast from the earth. We had identified that those beasts were in representation of getting their power from the devil, Satan himself, and they were all aligned. And Tolu used the word an unholy alliance. Um, in contrast to the triune God in how they operate. So although the John's description of the scarlet beast isn't known or shown, I would say there's some reference. Once again, the text doesn't really call it out as the same, but there's reference to this beast as at least an individual or a particular kingdom or king that will rise up in uh, as you said earlier on, just in partnership. In the woman is sitting on the scarlet beast and basically gaining power, or at least in working in tandem with the beast that has the seven horns, right? Seven.
Yeah.
What's the reference there?
Let me
Seven mountains or
Yep.
seven heads there. As we read further, as the meaning of what's going on is shared from the angel to John in the rest of chapter 17.
Yep.
And so I think this beast is symbolizes just probably another kingdom or king. Now there's a lot of speculation. I would say people think during this time, because John was under Roman influence, that these are referring to the seven hills of Rome. But I don't think so, because the meaning here was pointed out that there are actually seven kings or seven kingdoms. So I don't think Rome is the central point here from just reading the text and the explanation given. I think you could say there could be seven kingdoms prior to, the Roman one being the fifth one or the sixth, depending. But there's a lot of interpretation here, and I subscribe in staying to the lane. It's not said there. It's interesting how people come up with interesting stuff,
That's
but
right.
we need to just stick to what is being shared. But all of these things are shown here. But the beast, simply, I think it's probably related to the one that is this beast coming from the sea,
Yep.
and the important thing that we want people to take away, at least from me, in reading this this chapter is just so fascinating to me in difference between 17 and 18, especially what happens to Babylon, whereby
Yes.
there was hatred. As you read later on, there's a hatred, but we'll get to that soon. But anyway, I believe that this beast rises up and gets influence in partnership with what was going on with the woman, but
Hmm.
ultimately there is hatred from all these seven mountains or heads and the 10 horns being representing kings as well, towards the alliance. And they will be all, and really the point is they are all in opposition to the lamb, as was pointed out. And it's all part of God's amazing plan, as the angels explains, in later on in verses 17 towards and the end of this chapter, where he points out that all of this is to fulfill God's amazing plan, leading to the full destruction of Babylon itself. So, but yes, I believe the beast is just reminiscence of what we've learnt about in the first beast that we learnt about in earlier chapters of the one from the sea. So
Yeah, yeah, no, and you know what? I should probably have read the section before you go on choir, but I'll read it now. So let
yes,
me
go
just
ahead.
read Revelation, yeah, 7 to 14. So this is after John says he saw the woman and he marveled. And then the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was, and is not, and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an eighth, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are yet to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. They are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful.
Yes.
Okay, do you want to add anything else
Yes,
before I
yeah,
go?
I do. This is I once again John's imagery of this vision is so key. Just a couple of things to point out. It points out that the beast comes. It said it's probably the seventh and eighth. It's interesting there. So it is important that we notice that, and we know that the angels had already revealed the meaning behind what the beast is, and these 7 heads that is pointing out. So we know that this is going to be a kingdom or a king, but let's just say it represents either an individual or a kingdom going there. That's it, so let's start with that. It shows that this is coming from the bottomless pit, but it's going to come. Its end is destruction. So it's important. He says that twice. Use another version says perdition, but it's as Tolu's version translation read destruction. He talks about the 10 heads starting in verse 12, which is another set that is separate from the 7. But the importance of the 10 heads is that their purpose is to give up their power or to unite and give allegiance to this particular beast. Now, I know Femi had identified this beast as the Antichrist, which is one symbolism that is being used earlier on. Either way, whatever you come up with, I think this is an individual that is being shared here. But at the end of the day, it represents a king or a kingdom that will be destroyed, that these 10 individuals or these 10 kings that do not have a kingdom yet will give their allegiance. And the whole point is they will be giving their allegiance to. But look at what he says about Jesus. This is what I want people to remember. Although their main purpose is to be in opposition to the Lamb, look at what John says here in verse 14. They will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. The angel has spent time explaining the meaning behind these kingdoms and kings of the 7 hills and the 10 horns, but he says Christ will obliterate them, and because he's the King of all kings, he's the Lord of all lords. So right. I want folks to really key in on verse 14 there, because the ultimate goal, in whether you subscribe that this is a particular individual, a world dictator, Antichrist, whoever it is, or it represents kingdoms, the whole point is that they're in opposition to the Lamb and his faithful ones, but the Lamb will obliterate them because he's that King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords, and there's nothing that can stand in his way. So I think this is showing the preparation of what we will get to in another episode, in ushering Christ's return and Christ, but all of these are sequences. I believe chapter 17 and 18 are sequences that happen that culminate the final ushering, the revealing, the revelation of Jesus coming through to obliterate this. But it's important that we show that. Those are some things I want to point out. So yeah, go ahead, Tolu.
Yeah, and as often as we've seen, even though we might come at it differently, we usually end up in the same conclusions, which I think it's important. I know sometimes we get very interested in who are these 10 kings, who is this 5 kingdoms that have been, who is this kingdom to come or this king to come. And I get all that, and I'll speak to all of that, but I think it's always important that we focus on the core message of the passage, which is what you've just clearly said, that at the end of it all, even though you see all this activity, whatever Babylon represents, which we believe represents just world systems throughout all the ages, and has this corrupting influence, and I'll get to these kings and horns, but whatever they represent, they make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb wins. Jesus wins, like we've always talked about, right? At the end of the day, Jesus wins, which is what is important. So going back to the passages, I wanted to quickly touch on what could they possibly mean in that sense, right? So the way I kind of come at it on Choir is I have been looking at beast in Revelation as representative of kingdoms, or like just world systems, kingdoms, and primarily I'm using the reference from Daniel, where Daniel has those visions of the 4 beasts in Revelation 7 to 12, and he talks about the kingdoms that will come afterwards. So I've been looking at it from that angle, and because we see Babylon as this world system, I kind of saw the scarlet beast which I agree with you. I believe it's linked to the first beast that we see. Remember that dragon is called the red dragon, and so you have a scarlet beast here. So I believe it's linked to that, and so I kind of see that scarlet beast again as Satan working his power through human kingdoms, governments, empires, nations, and what have you in that sense. And so, with all the description of like, like you rightly said, right? When people see things like the woman is sitting on seven mountains, they think immediately of Rome, right? Seven Hills, Rome, and the particular situation that John is in under the thumb of Rome, right? I also agree with you that I don't think it's necessarily Rome. I just see it as, again, representative of human kingdoms and nations, which has obviously been corrupt. Things like five are falling, one is, the other has not yet come. I kind of see it as, because I see I think it's here we have the seven heads and then the 10 horns. I see the seven heads as seven number of completion, almost like representing almost like this complete reign of the enemy, but it's really incomplete. And so I see the things like five have fallen, one is yet to come, or something like that. I see it more so as saying that, look, this reign of the enemy that seems to be comprehensive, it's coming to an end. It has its time, its end, its time is drawing near, the end is drawing near in that sense, right? And then, like you rightly said, the 10 kings, I can't tell you exactly that this is who they are or what it refers to. I can't say that exactly. But again, I just see all of that as saying that, look, whatever that represents, whoever these 10 kings are, you made a reference to something that was interesting, the beast that is the eighth, but it's part of the seventh, all those interesting things. I think part of what's interesting here is that all of them yield their power to this beast, essentially, right? And again, they make war with the lamb, and the lamb overcomes, which I think is the central point there, that the lamb overcomes.
It is.
Yes, and so I definitely agree with that. I wanted to read the last part of
Yeah, let's do that.
Revelation
It's very,
17.
it's very
Yeah,
interesting.
because I think it's interesting. And so, if we recall, as we're going through this, right, John sees this woman, Babylon the Great. He marvels. Whether that marvel is just looking at her in awe, or he's in dread of her, whatever it may be. The angel basically kind of, you could say, maybe kind of rebukes him, or basically kind of says, "Let me show you what will actually happen." And then the angel describes the beast, right, which is what we've talked about. But then when we get to verse 15, I think it's interesting what the angel says, which I think is a precursor to what we will see in Revelation 18. So verse 15 says, "And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over the royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." What would you like to expound out from that
Yeah,
on?
yeah. There's some that believe that this verses that Tolu just read depict the, I've been sharing that there's this whole 7 day, 7 year period, and that this this culmination that is described as the world leaders that initially has been shown that they were drunk with the fornication. The world uses fornication, basically sexual immorality, with the woman, and now purposed against her
That's
with
right.
the beast, right? And showing it begins to show the destruction of Babylon here. The interesting thing is that, John depicts this in his vision, that this is to fulfill God's purposes, that the very thing, the very world system of which these 10 kings were we're drunk with is this that it is what contributes to Babylon's downfall, which is just once again only the mind of God can come up with this, which is why the angel points out this is all part of God's purposes. So some believe that this is the halfway period of the three period. We've already explained that for the dispensationalists, this is their perspective, that this is when the world power comes in and takes that perspective as a whole. For me, I see this as just a fulfillment of God's plan. I still see this from, yes, John uses the fact that the waters that the hollow sits are people and multitudes, but we've already explained that because this is already a world system, it makes sense that it connotates the influence that the woman has, right?
That's right.
And then the kingdom piece. But the important takeaway for me in this section of scripture that Tolu just read is that the destruction of Babylon itself comes from within. The same thing that has adorned it with its glory that people have seen ends up being contributing to its final demise, which we'll learn later on in chapter 18. So no matter whether you believe, I would say at one time I used to see it as the tribulation. I still think they're still part of the Great Tribulation period, as Scripture shows. But as people will say, "Oh, this is the halfway through the." Once again, I'm looking literally at the. There's no timeline here, but rather than ascribe that this is my stance, I'm very careful. I've just learned over not to subscribe to one perspective, but just see it as the full destruction of Babylon here comes from within, comes from the same people that had been drunk with its influence, ends up contributing to its downfall here, is the way I see this. So, anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I think that really is the core point here. I think sometimes when we even think of just world systems in general, when you think of world systems where either the government or the people in the power, they really hold on to power, they get power by all means necessary, boots to heel, so to say. What often happens is by them getting that power, they kind of strangulate what gets them into that power, like the economics, the commerce in that sense, because then they take it for themselves. There's greed in that sense, which ends up usually destroying those same empires. It's funny that we see a similar parallel here, where if at least from how I see it, if the woman is representative of the world system, the culture, the mindset, the values, all of that, and then if the beast is representative of empires or kingdoms and nations and things of that nature, you see that it is actually the beast, right? That and the kings that tear apart the woman. Like you see that they're the ones that bring about judgment on the woman. So it's almost like those in power kind of destroy their own golden goose, so to say, in a sense.
Yeah.
But regardless, I think the key point here, or at least what stands out to me, Uncle, is that this statement that says God had put it in their hearts to
Yeah.
carry out his purpose by being of one mind, handing over power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And so we're seeing the judgment on Babylon, on which we believe is the world system, by the beast. And we're seeing that this is actually the doing of God. It is God that put it into their hearts. And then we will see in chapter 18 what that judgment actually looks like. And we get a better view also of this beast or these kings and how they actually interact with this woman and how they benefit from it. So if we switch over to chapter 18, and let me
Yeah. Let's
turn
do
there.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to start by again reading some portion of this and then asking a question. So far we've looked at this complex relationship between the woman and the beast, and it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. At least from what was said, she's sitting on the beast, right, in Revelation 17. Now we've seen what will happen. But I think as we read chapter 18, one of the things I would want us to focus on is the characteristics of the woman, what the description of who she is, but the description of their relationship And just to get more and more into this relationship between the woman and the beast and some features we see what that tells us. But we know that the ultimate power or authority behind the destruction of Babylon the Great is God, right? Which again reminds us of God's sovereignty. So, before we get into it, let me read Revelation 18. Let me go 1 to. Sorry, let me quickly look at this. I think I can go 1 to 8. Let me go 1 to 8, and then we can talk about that. So chapter 18. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid others back, has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion of her in the cup she mixed. And as she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burnt up with fire, for mighty is the Lord who has judged her.
Yeah, yeah.
Please, Uncle, go ahead and give us your thoughts on that passage and what comes out to you.
Yeah, so so here is, I'm just supposing 17 and 18 on how Babylon is described here. And we already talked in 17 earlier on in the first 6 verses on the adornment, the beauty, the dazzling, the outside representation of what
That's right.
Babylon is depicted here. But none of that is seen in these first few verses where another angel comes in. It's like what Tolu likes to use the word, it's a recap, recapitulation, yeah. Very much just another way to see the same view. And there's a similar, you could say that there's that happening here in chapter 18. It's just another spin in showing what this destruction or falling is Babylon that John is kind of sharing here based on what these angels are revealing to him, right? So in the first few verses of chapter 18, unlike how Babylon was described in the outward appearance of it, now this particular angel describes really the core, what's going internally,
Right.
on basically says a dwelling place of demons,
Yeah.
every unclean spirit, for
That's right.
every hated bird. So this is the core. This is the true Babylon. Let's put it that way. It's
Yep.
not. It's not what was adorned in the outside of it that brought amazement or awesomeness to even John and anyone that saw its beauty. The core is the destruction from the pit of hell, really, and yes, nations that have drunk in and participated, influenced by its sexual immorality. This is really what the core of what they've been influenced by. The other piece I want to talk about is what I mentioned earlier on, that we see Babylon being described, as Tola and I have already explained, is the world system, the religious piece. Here, there's the portion of the economic system, the influence that Babylon has by talking about the rulers of the earth, those who have been swayed by her influence, have participated, they become rich. The merchants have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. I'm reading from New King James, but that's what verse 3 points out. And it says that later on, that the double portion of the judgment that comes upon is also coming from the glorification that this spiritual Babylon has adorned herself with, and once again it contributed to her demise. Similar enough, as you all heard at the beginning of this session, I had explained even the physical one was known for her beauty and her glory, but it is in ruins today. It's the same connotation being shared here that the angel reveals, or the voice from heaven. I'll get to the last portion before I give it to Tolu, but I think chapter 18 reveals the core central message of what Babylon is, which is pretty much she's just from the pit of hell, described just from like the beast that came from the pit of hell. Babylon's world system is definitely it may be looks great on the outside, but as Jesus described, the religious leaders says that, woe to me, you guys adorn yourself with physical beauty, but you're whitewashed tombs on the east side. The same kind of similar description here of Babylon's true nature is one that is really bad. And then in the rest of 18, two things before I give Tolu to share his perspective. It points out Babylon's desires in being, that basically proudness, similar to what, Isaiah 14 is about Lucifer's downfall, being proud. It says here her plagues will come in one day. To me, I think is reminiscent of the physical Babylon. If you guys remember, Daniel talked about how Belshazzar, who took over from Nebuchadnezzar, was killed in one day when the next kingdom came and destroyed and pretty much brought the Babylonian Empire during Nebuchadnezzar's day and Belshazzar's day in one fell swoop, and was destroyed by Belshazzar being killed by Darius when he showed up there. And everything was final during that time. And that's what is being described here and showing the finality. We'll see the ultimate one as we go deeper in chapter 18, but it's referencing that. The last thing I want to point out is in verse 4, where it says that I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of our... Now, the reference here is my people, lest you share in her sins. So there's this heart of still repentance that we talked about in the previous episode, that, despite, if you go back and you read chapter 16, you will see that one of the judgment from the seven bowls revealed was the Euphrates River being dried up, and Babylon was referenced there, by the way. And then it talks about people still having an unrepentant heart, even though God's heart was still repentant. And here is the angel providing a warning, saying, hey, do not be tied. To me, in the midst of true judgment and justness of the Father, there's still this heart of calling those who are his to repent and not be carried away on the final judgment over Babylon. So those are my thoughts, and let you share your perspective. So.
No, thank you so much, Uncle. And I think you shared, again, I agree with essentially all you've said and what it represents. I love what you said about how this chapter is kind of showing us the true Babylon, at least the earlier part, I think verses 1 to 3 or so, showing you the real state of what Babylon is, as opposed to what we see on the outside. I think some other interesting things that jump out to me, you mentioned the call for us Christians to come out of Babylon. Now, given all that we've said about Babylon being the world system, and that's the system in which we work and we go to our offices and do what, I don't think the point is to say don't work or just be
Yeah.
completely out of it. I think it's more so our values. It's more so what we're chasing. It's more so our heart posture and our intention. And are we sacrificing our values in an attempt to become more richer, more wealthier, and to have more status and to be accepted? And I think we see more of that as well. I think there's a clear reference when he says the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. We have meaning they've bought into whatever it is that Babylon the Great represents, which we know that Babylon the Great and what it represents is anti-God. So they bought into that, and I think that would be an application point for us as we
Yeah.
examine ourselves in terms of that call for us to come out. I wanted to go back again to that passage because, like you rightly said, this feels like another recapitulation. We already saw in chapter 17 that Babylon is going to be judged. And I think verse 18 is showing us more and more what that judgment, well, showing us more and more what Babylon looks like, and then we'll also see what the judgment looks like in that sense. I thought it was also interesting a point you raised where you talked about how all of our plagues will come in one day. And I think later on in verse 9, I think it talks about how our judgment will come in an hour. And I think that just shows
Correct.
that it will be sudden, right? In that sense,
Yeah.
that
To be
judgment is
swift. Yeah.
coming. Yes, exactly. I think that's the better word. It will be swift in that sense, and it will be complete. So that being said, I didn't have much to add, and I wanted to kind of move us along to then see a little bit more about what this judgment looked like.
Yeah.
Like we've seen
Yeah.
some of it, but I think verses 9 to 20 will kind of show us a little bit more. Will show us a little bit more of the state of Babylon, the features of Babylon, but also these kings and these merchants that have engaged with Babylon. We will see their state and we will see how they respond to her judgment. Now, remember that God, it's been said in chapter 17 that God is using those same the kings to bring about that judgment. It would just be interesting to see what then that looks like, what their own responses is. So I wanted to read that, and I also wanted to ask some questions off of that. So let me read from verses 9 to 20. So verses 9 says, "And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore." I want to read that again. "And the merchants of the earth," which is also representative of these kings, "they weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, of silver, of jewels, of pearls, of fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves, that is, human souls." Verse 14, "The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls, for in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all those whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their head as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." So, Uncle, I wanted to start off that when you look at this merchant, and or you can say these kings, right, that are weeping over Babylon's judgment. I guess I wanted to ask two questions about that. One is, why are they truly weeping? Like, what is actually behind their weeping? And then two is, what do you find curious in their wares? You know, there's a list there of the things they're trading
Yeah.
with Babylon that has made them wealthy. Is there anything that you find weird in that list, or what does that list connote to you? And then why are these merchants actually weeping? Why are these seamen actually lamenting? What is the cause of this lament?
Yeah, yeah. Let's start with that particular question. On so first of all, it's we I once again I love the imagery and the concentration that John in his vision is showing here, because I think the specificity that he's showing is important, that we not take away from it. And because of time, we just don't have time to go deeper into this. So we have to, I want to be leery of it. So I believe why these merchants are showing, once again, I think this is it describes the economic commerce, the system that Tolu and I have eloquently already described so far, that Babylon represents. In this case, he's talking about the economic system that I think these folks are lamenting because they've lost what brought money for them. So it's
Right.
interesting, right? So their source of income or their source of richness, the luxuriousness, my version shares, that was already talked about in the previous chapter and earlier on, was what they were drunk with. Now, because of true judgment that has come, they now lament over her because,
That's right.
oh, it to me was even a true lament in the sense that, oh, I've now lost my source of income that I don't have anymore. So
Yep.
that's the way I believe it's being depicted. And I'll share why. In chapter 17, briefly, there was no description of any lament. It was actually um, it was actually, like we already said, part of the destruction was coming from within. It was hatred for what was going on. So there was no picture of lament. And here, there's now a picture of lament. And I think it's not true. It's not a true sorrowful thing. Yes, there is some towards the end, but this initial lament comes from the fact that the source of their income has now been diminished or eradicated. So that's the first thing. That's the way I see it. The second thing is in the list there, as you pointed out, Tolu, it shows the gold and silver. It then moves to spices, right? Cinnamon, fragrant oil. But look at one of which says now, my version says the bodies and souls of men. Let's not forget that. So it talks about slavery here. It talks
Yep.
about it wasn't just possession um, of things. It's a possession of people. So let's not forget that Babylon was influential, not just in possession of things, but also in possession of people as well. You know,
That's right.
so, but that's what I'll say. And then the last thing I'll point out, because the rest of it is just description, as you pointed out, Tolu, of how this great city, there's a lot of reference, this great city, but it has come down to pretty much it's now destroyed. This
Yep.
great city, the lament has shown that what it created, as where the world came to, was the way it was built around, was everything was emanated. This was the center of
That's right.
commerce, but it ends up being being destroyed. Nothing came from it. That no one could do anything anymore because of the destruction of it. The last thing I want to point out is that he says in verse 19, they threw dust in their head, and that's just sorrow. That just depicts sorrow.
Yep.
That, folks, it's like the same when we see in the Old Testament when they put on ashes and sackcloth.
That's right.
This is the same description that, we know that famous story in Jonah where the city of Assyria as part of their lament, put on sackcloth and ashes to depict outside what was going on. So that's kind of the same picture here. And the last thing is the juxtaposition. Just one verse, Tolu. Verse 20 is the juxtaposition of what was going on in earth,
That's right.
of this destruction going on, and in heaven
That's right.
of true judgment being celebrated. Once
That's right.
again, not like, oh, we're happy that these things are going on, but to me is, remember on the previous episode we shared that even part of worship, true worship, is celebrating God's justice as
That's
well.
right.
So this is a reminder to me of what's going on in heaven is celebrating God's justice, rightly so, because it was tied to worship, versus what was going on in earth, which is the full destruction. And, we'll talk about the last set of verses yet, but this is just an expansion of what that destruction is looking at before we did what we find out and learn the finality of that. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, again, I completely agree with what you've said. I think to your point, their so-called despair, I think, or their mourning is that they are mourning, and this is the merchants and the kings, they are
Yeah,
mourning the downfall of Babylon because of the prosperity of their
that they
trade that
received.
depends
Yeah,
on her. Exactly. Like that's where their mourning is coming from. It's not that they're mourning because they really care. And you also see that they're staying far away. There's like this
yes,
distance, right, from what's going on in that sense. So they're pretty much there to save their own hide in that sense, which again, we see a lot. Evil destroys evil in that sense, and there's no loyalty in that sense. So that sort of jumps out to me, like you rightly said. And I would also say that what we can see is obviously when we say Babylon is the systems of this world, I think again this passage is depicted rightly because it's kind of like this pinnacle of global commerce and world luxury. And you see the listing of all the things that people traded and the wealth and the influence that it has. And one of the things that I think about when I look at this, and I'm thinking about it from an application point of view, is that what are those things that have become so pervasive in our mindset, our beliefs, our values that are actually very much set against God, but we have bought into, we've excused ourselves on in that sense, and we've essentially turned our backs to God, even though we might think we're serving Him. Because that influence, the woman sitting on the beast on many waters, shows our influence, shows our corrupting influence, I should say, in that sense. And again, that just calls us back to this place of repentance. I love what you said as well, the juxtaposition of that verse 20, where we see this mourning on earth in that sense, but then what's happening in heaven is different. And we'll see that also with the rest of the verses in chapter 18. But we could also call it this juxtaposition of those that are in the camp of the woman and the beast versus those that are in the camp of God. And we see this juxtaposition in terms of how they respond to this judgment. So let me read the rest of the verses and then ask a question to wrap things up here. So maybe I'll start from verse 20 because I think it goes together. So verse 20 says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." So God has given judgment for the saints, for the apostles, for the prophets, for the people of God against this woman, this prostitute, Babylon the Great. Verse 21. "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. And the sounds of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all those who have been slain on earth." You've already answered this question, but I'll kind of ask it again in terms of this juxtaposition between the camp of God and the camp of the enemy. And then also that what is this reassurance for the persecuted and the struggling church? Like, how does this description of Babylon's fall give us hope?
Yeah,
How does it give us reassurance? So those will be
yeah.
the questions I'll ask. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I would say, to me, it's this final crescendo of the full totality of Babylon's destruction. This last set of verses really then depict the finality, this whole, that millstone being thrown, and we talked about it earlier on, showing the swiftness, the violence. It says with violence and swiftness, this thing comes down. It also has this reference of this was thrown in the sea, and it was thrown down, and now shall not be found of. Now, I love the description, Tolu. I just love the fact that what Babylon was known for, this beauty of sounds and flutes, musicians, and light and commerce, joy, those were counterfeits. To first of all, to start out with, let's be honest, they were counterfeits. Babylon didn't possess any of it to
That's right.
start out with. They just, we know that Satan likes to parade himself as an angel of light. So it's not surprising that he wants to copy these things. And that's what these merchants, these kingdoms were influenced by. But like we already discussed earlier on, it shows their finality because they never had it to begin with. It was all a counterfeit to start out with. And here the mighty angel describes the true form, not only of the fact that they never possessed these things, but they would not be known for it. Babylon would not be known for it. And this brings the full finality of it. And this should give us hope to the answer of the second question. This should give us hope because, first of all, we've been saying as our central theme, God wins. There's no difference here. God, the Father, and His Son, we celebrate that. He wins. The full end and full destruction of Babylon is now shown, and Babylon is no more. It doesn't have these things anymore. And then in the fact and the last verse, then 24 of the blood of the prophets and saints, those who have been proclaiming the word, that it may seem as if as chapter 17 had depicted that Babylon was drunk, right, with it used what the form of the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, was drunk with the blood of the martyr of saints in chapter 17, verse 6. Here,
Yes.
it shows that they've been avenged. It shows God's victory over what's happened with Babylon, and Babylon will cease to exist, in this form. Anyway, and that should bring hope. The finality of Babylon's destruction brings hope that ultimately this has been that crescendo being building up. It's like that movie. I love that description of just the movie looking towards the end, that it's been vanquished. And obviously we just not to jump ahead because I can't wait to talk about chapter 19. But it's just depicting why this brings hope, because Babylon is no more. And even the merchants, even the angels sharing that they do not, the things that Babylon was supposedly known for, which I would argue was a counterfeit all along, was known for, isn't known for anymore. Those things will never be found, and because it never really had the true portion of those to start out with. But those things that Babylon was no more is no more, and the lament is done, is over, and instead there should be hope for God's people and His faithful and true worshippers. So I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Amen. No, no, no. That's it. There's nothing for me to add, but I wanted to just summarize and then wrap things up in that sense. I think so far, when you look at the book of Revelation, right? We have the description of Jesus and him giving the message to John in chapter 1. You have the messages to the 7 churches, but it's also messages to all churches, because we know there are more than 7 churches at the time. And then we see the struggling of the church, like the faithful churches, right, are struggling. On the outside, they have little power, they are oppressed, yet God is pleased with them. And then we see the unfaithful churches, where on the outside they look like everything is going great, kind of like what we said
Great.
with
Yeah.
Babylon, but on the inside it's not true and God is displeased. And then when we get to Revelation 4, we see the throne room of God, which reminds us of the sovereignty of God in the midst of the persecution that the faithful churches are facing. And I think chapter 5 kind of encapsulates what would then become the opening of the scroll, the judgments of God, basically God's own redemptive plan, at least towards the end of the ages. And then we've seen the cycles of judgment, which, and I have to say again, this is from my perspective, it's been the recapitulation of what will God do, right? So we see it with the 7 seals, we see it with the 7 trumpets, we see it with what I think is 7 symbolic histories, we see it with the 7 bowls. And then I actually think the rest of Revelation is going to laser focus on certain key events, all towards the end of time. So we're seeing the judgment of the world system, almost like God bringing that to an end, right? And what these 2 chapters do for us, I think they do a few things for us as Christians, is that one, we are not to marvel or fear Babylon, in the sense of we are not to be seduced by the allurement of Babylon, whether it be its wealth, its culture, the comfort, because those things are attractive. We have to admit that we all like to be very comfortable and to be wealthy, but here we are called to not be a part of her, to come out from her, to be separate from her. That's not to say you can't be rich or you shouldn't start businesses or do commerce. That's not saying that, but that's saying that those goals you have for your businesses and commerce and your career and those things, they shouldn't conflict with your values, they shouldn't conflict with your beliefs, they shouldn't conflict with where you stand for God, and that we pick God over those things. And so there's this call to us that we know the end of Babylon, we know the end of this world system, therefore we shouldn't be seduced by her or fear her. Like I said, we're called to be separate. We're called to fidelity to Christ. And then I also think in these passages, like you just said, on choir, we see the woman being drunk with the blood of saints, the blood of martyrs, is that we will face persecution as Christians. And sometimes that might be even unto death. But we are still not to fear Babylon or fear the world system nor the beast. We can always trust in God. And so there's this call for perseverance in the face of persecution and suffering, but also repentance for those who are not repentant. Enquire, you picked up that point in Revelation 16, where as the bowls are poured out, there are at least 2 instances where the punishment is severe, but the people continue to be unrepentant. Their hearts continue to be hardened. And so I think for us as Christians, part of what we can take from this is the need to repent. That where we have compromised or we've been unfaithful, we can be repentant, and we should hold on to God even if our faithfulness leads to poverty and marginalization. God sees and God knows. And I think at the end of it all, we are to see that God's judgment, like you said, Uncle, is praiseworthy. The judgments of God are praiseworthy. We are to worship God for the judgment He's bringing, and we are to trust in Christ's ultimate victory. Like you said, when we get into verse 19, we are going to see Christ's victory. We are going to see the triumph of the Lamb. We've already seen at the end of Revelation 17 where it says that, the beast and the horns, even after tearing apart the woman, they make war against the Lamb, and the Lamb overcomes. And that's what we can always anchor on, that Jesus wins. At the end of the day, He wins. Uncle, I wanted to give you the spot if you had anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up for this session.
Yeah, so I mean, Tolu's described well this exposition of chapters 17 and 18. Babylon, along with the beast and the kings, everything represents opposition to God's ways. We've seen how we've learned how the once again on the outside of it, it may look that everything is dazzling, but but then we see the true meaning as chapter 18 kind of leans on. And to me, the idolatry portion of which Babylon was known for and the abominations is anything that puts itself in place of true worship that belongs to Almighty God. And so we as believers need to remember that, that ultimately all of this will be defeated, and it is important, as Tolu already eloquently shared, that we may be in the world, but we should not be of it, and we need to recognize the importance of making sure that nothing takes the place of what true worship for the Father means. So we've learned the final destruction of Babylon, and ultimately, what the references to what happens in heaven, and the references of Christ overcoming and obliterating the influence of what Babylon and the beast would do. As you know, and on the next episode, we will learn more about the ushering. All of these events that we've been talking about is leading to the full ushering, the unveiling of Jesus. Now we've already seen glimpses of that, but my excitement, I can't contain my excitement, because it just ties to the hope that I can imagine John sharing this, Tolu, and sharing this, and people are reading this. The first century believers are reading what John was sharing, and I can't but imagine that, like you said, they may have been being persecuted under the current Roman industrial domination, as we talked about. But the way John has weaved through this vision how Christ overcomes, how the testimony of his people overcomes, how the faithful and true overcomes, I cannot but remind our fellow participants with us in that's truly the whole thing here. Christ overcomes. The goal is the revelation of Jesus, and I hope people have seen the glimpses of that as we as we come to the final portion of Revelation, because this ends a particular significant point, and then, as Tolu pointed out, we are now going to see more what that finality of this whole system looks like as we see the full unveiling of Jesus with the destruction of Babylon and the influence that it represents.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Uncle. And thank you, our listeners, for being here with us today. We appreciate that. Again, this is the Rightly Dividing podcast, the podcast for those who love God, who want to know more about God, and want to empower others to know God. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.